Hi, everybody. I'll give you a chance to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 974th New Social Environment and the first NSE of 2024. I'm really grateful to be in this space with you all, and I hope you've been taking care at the start of this new year. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Kari Cholnoky and Gaby Collins-Fernandez. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Through their material composition and conceptual concern, Kari Cholnoky's paintings puzzle out the inherent paradoxes and entropy of the present. Eschewing the traditional supports of stretcher and canvas, Cholnoky paints with space and time, each painting an assemblage of materials, color, and collaged images built up slowly in a mutative process. Cholnoky holds an MFA in painting from Cranbrook Academy of Art and a BA from Dartmouth College, and currently lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. Last year, Cholnoky was a MacDowell Fellow in painting. And our host today, Gaby Collins-Fernandez, is an artist living and working in New York City. She holds degrees from Dartmouth College and the Yale School of Art. Her work has been shown in the US and internationally, including at Peter Freeman, the Birmingham Museum of Art, and El Museo del Barrio. We are so lucky to have her as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I will pass it over to Gaby.
Hi, everybody. Happy New Year. I hope everyone is is feeling some degree of hope, and that we can try to work together to make this year better than it seems like it might be. Anyway, it's my real pleasure to be here today with Kari Cholnoky, an artist who I've known for over a decade, and whose work I've admired since I've known her. And just wanted to shout out your fabulous show, Horizontal Loader, which is up at Nicelle Beauchene until through the end of next week. So it's great that there's still some time to see the work. And I just wanted to open the conversation. You know, your work is so interesting for so many reasons. But I think on a primary level, like the work really engages a first impression in a way that's like pretty aggressive in terms of how it uses color, the way that you use shapes, the textural elements. There's like a lot of toxicity, a lot of neon, this like weird kind of like uncanny valley hair sensations. And I think I just wanted to start the conversation asking you how you planned this show, what went into Horizontal Loader, and to just give us sort of like a basic overview of what you were thinking about and how you approached this body of work.
Well, I guess, once Nicelle invited me to do the show, it was really just like about trying to imagine the work being in such a big room. Like I've never had like a big show like this before. So a lot of the planning that went into it just had to do with like getting this opportunity to have things have a little space, which, the work is obviously dense. So I was imagining things being able to sort of occupy a bigger area. But, the work takes a long time to make. So most of it was just about giving it 2 years of just working on the show and not really much else. And what that meant for me was working on a larger body of work than what went into the show. Because I just didn't know what would be done exactly in time. So I had to work on a bunch of things in order to have a few things sort of congeal around the time of install. Obviously with things like the freestanding pieces, I tell people I'm not like a lunatic, and I don't make things at that scale just like for fun in my studio. I don't have enough space to live like that. So I made those knowing that they would go into the show, and that they would leave the studio at least for like 5 weeks. And then, if they come back, then I'll have to deal with them on the opposite end. But I made them knowing they'd have like a room to go in at some point.
Mm. So one of the things about, I mean, your work is, you use the word density, which I think is correct. And it's sort of, it's a really kind of strange kind of density because they, like, the work announces itself as what it is in a way that's sort of immediate. And there are a lot of affective parts of the work that feel very immediate. And then there's this other kind of slower reveal in the work, which has to do with like how the work starts to look kind of like an artifact, and you can tell that there is actually quite a lot of work that went into the creation of a number of layers. So when I look at your work, this happens when I think about the surface, you know, and like literally how gummy things are, like how like baked in all of the different components feel in relationship to one another. But I think there's also actually like a version of archaeology, which is part of the pleasure of looking at your work, because um it like really quickly becomes apparent that these are actually composited forms that appear to be held together by like uniformity of color or something like this, or uniformity of surface, but that like there's actually quite a lot which is baked in there in a different way. Like the surfaces are all come from different places. There are images that sort of mingle between different kinds of textures. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like this idea about sedimentation and this process that sort of like almost consumes the world and covers it with this particular sensibility, which is really specifically yours.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I think like I sort of think part of the like assembling of paintings instead of just directly the painting of paintings, like why I would choose to use an image instead of paint the image, strangely has to do with like mark and the hand. And, you know, with some of the imagery I use and then the material, painting the images ends up sort of bouncing the conversation back to me, the artist, like, you know, my mark and my hand and myself get dragged into the work and really fuck up the meaning of the work or people's experience with the work and turn it into like how kinky the artist is. So a lot of the impulse in like destroying that part of the conversation comes from just like wanting to deflect away from that. Like just look at the image, don't like turn this into some character trait of the artist. So that I think is behind a lot of the decisions to apply material instead of like paint or, you know, illusionistically represent what the material would be doing otherwise. But yeah, I think in terms of sedimentation, something I love about that process is this like history that you get just from layering things. Like the painting accumulates stuff, material, information, destruction over time just by existing, in the same way that the planet does, in the same way that we do, maybe on a more psychic level, that models our body or models the surface of the planet and then holds this kind of record. So you have to believe that there's like a embedded kind of energy via material and time. And I think also like, you know, when we look for information from the geologic record, there's this amazing abstraction process that's happening tectonically, you know, via pressure. Like with more material comes more weight, and weight starts to really beautifully confuse things. So there's like a process of geologic shearing where fossils become warped and stretched. You know, we assemble dinosaur bones incorrectly and invent things like the brontosaurus. There's this kind of like inherent abstraction process that goes along with something that should feel really straightforward, going back through the record and extrapolating a history or something, when ultimately we're sort of just dealing with how the surface element affects our ability to read what's underneath.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that like the way that you talk about the hand and like limiting the hand, I think there's like important things that maybe we can talk about later around like the way the works invite certain kinds of like maybe unwelcome projections from an audience, but like let's put an asterisk there. But I feel like the way that you're, like the suppression of the hand, really, I think it encourages this sort of geologic read in the sense that everything in the work sort of feels found, because it retains some sort of characteristic that you have sort of like brought into the work versus this element of having been made, right? Where the idea of then the hand as a kind of like painterly thing versus a sensibility as a sort of like organizing force or something like this is something that I think is a really useful distinction when thinking about your work. But the way that you talk about the abstraction inherent in geology, or these kind of like natural processes feels especially interesting when thinking about this group of work because like the inevitability of this process, right, doesn't naturalize everything that we've put on the surface, right? Like geology will happen no matter how much like plastic we contribute to like the levels of sediment that are going to be included, right? The mechanism itself can hold artificiality, and it can sort of incorporate a lot of different elements that are human made, that are kind of like strewn around, that might also be found, that also allow these works to kind of function as a sort of, they're like almost like Rorschach is sort of an overused metaphor, but they're kind of like a scatter mirror or something of contemporary society. And so I feel, for instance, when I look at your work, that this is kind of like it's almost like a landscape representation of like what's around us, that we have to work to make a certain kind of sense of, whether that means that we do something like make fake dinosaurs by like figuring out a way of like rationalizing and naturalizing a past that we don't totally understand. Like similar kinds of approach, I think, are constantly at work in contemporary culture too. Like we make dinosaurs out of everything all the time, like pop culture, like current events, we try to put things together in ways that they don't actually describe what's physically there. I know that was a little bit of a ramble here, but I think that's one of the ways that I understand some of this kind of like logic of your work, that you have this sort of relentless curiosity about the world that exists around you, and how we can make sense of the combination of like, like trucks and detritus and sex toys and like sludge as like predominant features of a contemporary environment that we all have to live inside of.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of it in terms of like the impulse of making sense has to do with relating myself to being material or an object in the same way that, I'm looking at how the forces affect me, and my body in ways that are similar and different to other organic or inert material, sort of like considering myself amongst them.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about like the literal like stuff and images that you're drawn to? Like to my mind, they seem to kind of fall into sort of camps. There's like mushroom stuff, like mushroom decay, like growth stuff. And then there's like construction materials, there's like housing stuff and or kind of like institutional, like something related to like institutional architecture, like the construction stuff and the gurneys seem to have a kind of relationship to one another. And then also things related to representations of the body. And next to that, things that relate to like sensations the body might feel, like disgust or I think there's a lot of kind of like maniacal joy in your work as well,
Wait, so are you asking about images or the material?
I think both. I feel like there's sort of an impulse in your work to separate them from one another, but I'm gonna like go on a limb here and say that like images and material actually exist on a continuum for you.
Well, maybe I'll that's like, you're very smart. So maybe you're understanding things at a deeper level than I am, but
Okay,
I'm just
but
gonna
let's
talk
talk about it the way you,
I want to talk about the images and then I'll
Yeah.
talk about the
the
material.
stuff. Okay.
So the imagery, a lot of the imagery is of, well, not a lot of it. A bunch of the imagery comes from pictures of masturbators that I take from Amazon product pages. So like the pages where the things are being sold. My favorite images are the like bisection images that show the inside channels, or that show hands manipulating the shape. So they're these like strange kind of pseudo medical imagery. And there's this like, I'm just interested in them as being advertising images, like things that are designed to sell the thing. So they are literally supposed to represent some kind of desirability or something, but they're really fucked up, grotesque, strange kind of medical images too. Like a lot of the hands touching the masturbators are in nitrile gloves because the masturbators themselves are made out of self-lubricating silicone and are incredibly like nasty to touch. Like, so I love that they have these powdered gloves on in the pictures. So that's a subset of images. And then another large subset is just images I'm pulling from the news. Like my news app is BBC on my phone, and that's where I get like a bunch of images. So there are images of sort of like medical anomalies or oddities. Like there was a kid who had an abscess in his jaw and they went in to remove the abscess, and the abscess had 100 some odd teeth inside of it. So like I have an x-ray of that kid's jaw with the abscess with all the little teeth in it. Or like, you know, COVID produced all these amazing particle simulation images that showed like the vaporized like body. So particulate that comes out of your body that holds sickness or whatever, how it moves through space if you're in a conversation or if you're on a jog or if you're in the grocery store or whatever. So that was this kind of like beautiful imagery showing the obliterated body coming into contact with other people and modeling the people it came into contact with. So lots of news imagery. And then I used some images in this show of heads made by Franz Messerschmidt, who was sculpting in the 1770s. I think like, you know, in that painting we're looking at on the right, the green one against the wall, there are 3 heads. The top head is a Messerschmitt bust that has this kind of like maniacal smile stretched. The second one on that like top ribbon balcony looking thing is an image of She-Venom, who's from the Spider-Man universe. It's Venom's girlfriend, Anne Weyant, I think her name is, who had to take she had to form with the symbiote in order to, she's constantly having to save her ex-boyfriend Eddie Brock because he like gets into trouble, and she's got to form with the symbiote, which turns her into this insane weapon, and she like kills all these people and is haunted by the power she has from the symbiote and ends up throwing herself out of a window. And then the bottom image is another stretched image of one of those masturbators with the hands pulling the mouth open. Yeah, so I guess the Messerschmitt heads are the only like art object that's reproduced in collage form. And then the material looks like a lot of different material, but it's not. It's like faux fur, epoxy putty, wire, paper pulp, acrylic paint, and sometimes urethane foam. And then, so it's mostly synthetic, and I add some biological material to some paintings as well. Like that green painting has wisdom teeth in it. But yeah, I would say in terms of the forms that are referenced, they're like, you mentioned like the gurney, which for the 2 freestanding works, I was thinking about like this sort of like support that's used in the hospital for transport, but also like recovery or something. like a place where sickness and health happens. But oddly, they also like form this kind of position of repose or leisure, or, you know, some kind of like restful place. And, you know, I had a specific gurney in mind that when I was trying to find one on Craigslist during the pandemic, there was one that you could change the seating to be in 2 different orientations. And it just seeing the image of that sort of split my brain open, and I started thinking about the painting split in half in 2 different orientations. And you know, we all say as artists that artists will look at the edges of your work, but that most other viewers aren't that generous. So I was just thinking about a way to give people access to the edge and the front of the painting at the same time, to have this kind of like expanded view of looking at painting, which was getting both of those like sort of POVs at the same time. Like if there was like a perfect way of looking at a painting the way I wanted to make it, which included sort of like multi-dimensional viewing also.
Yeah, you talked about like the sort of like Renaissance model of exploded perspective drawings. And I think those sort of those are interesting because like the way that they're representational is not like, it's not about any kind of mimicry. It's about a kind of like understanding of an internal structure or an internal system. And I know another reference that you've been interested in for a long time are like control panels and control boards. And so I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about diagrams and how the work might function in a kind of diagrammatic sense.
Yeah. I was actually, you know, later when maybe if we talk about the zine that I made for the show, my friend Eric Freidenborg and I were talking about models. And how kind of inherently, so this is the first zine I made in 2018, called User's Manual. So I made an updated version for this show. This one just had machines and bunkers and weapons with women's names. But this new one, Eric and I were talking about models and the fact that they are sort of like, they're just frozen, like they're only accurate for a minute. But, and I think like, you know, they have this, there's this idea when we look at them, like they have a, that they're prophetic, or they tell what will happen, but they so often fail. And we saw this like kind of amazingly last summer with the North Atlantic Current. There was all this conversation about the North Atlantic Current stopping its circulation, which was talked about in my like freshman, you know, environmental science classes as an apocalyptic ecological disaster event. And suddenly, like, you know, hundreds of years earlier in the future, it was being proposed as a potential like summer 2023 activity. So there's this kind of like fallibility, despite the fact that when we look at something like a model, we think that it has this kind of like staying power. So, you know, I think a lot about how we render systems in art, and the history of that has a lot to do with geometry. Like the Western art world has taught us that like mathematics and logic and systems and technical art making is rendered through like precision and geometry and whatever. And I think that my understanding of systems in real time and space is that they are like a fucking mess. And I love exploded view diagrams because they are literally something on its way to becoming disordered. So if you take something like a, you know, an airplane engine, and you move all of the parts away from each other just enough so that you can see everything, you're hovering in this moment between functionality and disaster. And I just feel like I find them very compelling in their precarity, and also in their complexity. And I think when I'm thinking about the job artists have of translating the feelings of being inside of massive systems into art objects, I do feel like I relate to something that is between something mutating into something positive and something collapsing entirely via a process of entropy or something like that.
I think there's something really telling about like in your work, this question about like you know, like there are a lot of these sort of kind of like, I mean, they're false, every binary is a false binary, in like my opinion, but you know, there's like kind of like control, lack of control, something which is dangerous versus something which is like kind of in like banal, you know, usefulness, lack of usefulness, like everything kind of is able to move in between these, or be like anything could be activated toward any one of these poles at any time. And I think one that you return to over and over again is weaponization. Like I think in your work that almost everything could become a weapon, or anything could be used as a tool, which might be a weapon. And I think, you know, the way that you talk often, or you talk a little bit about gender in this way, and I think that there's a kind of there's a range in your work. There's a way in your work that like the like, you know, masturbators as the literal objectification of sex, right? As fetish, but in this case as advertisement, right? It's not even for pleasure, it's to sell the thing. Like the objectification of the body into a tool, right? For pleasure or otherwise. And then this like history of machines and war machines and their relationship to women, right? In the naming, the ancient naming of like guns for this Nordic person whose name was Gunilda, or you know, like the tendency to name warships after women. I think the question of how the body is weaponized, and I think in particular how gender is weaponized, is a really kind of deep part of your work. And maybe this is the place to return to the asterisk, because I also like, I think it's funny that, you know, the first question is like, do you, Kari Cholnoky, have a fetish? Where like the actual, you know, conversation is has to do with like how available gender feels to become weaponized or become objectified in particular ways, and how that's had consequences that are of course like much broader in the sense of like the military, or like these kinds of militarized concepts of gender than, you know, just masturbators, which are fascinating, but also kind of a different kind of tool, or a different kind of symbol.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, whether it's a bunker named Barbara or like a 20-pound masturbator named Lisa, I think what I get from that is just that I am both of them. Like, you know, when you talk about binaries, like their meaning is conditional based on what options we have available, or what society determines their meaning to be, or their parameters, right? So like what can be considered female or feminine is only based off of like sort of like the bumpers set up in the bowling alley where we're allowed to bounce between. And I think when I am shown by society what I am, or what is a stand-in for me, that's sort of like what I'm going off of or reacting to. And my you know, what I bring into the work is sort of like what I do, what I go off of being objectified, like as an object, then what kind of object, what do I look like? You know, I do feel like the work in this in some way is a stand-in for myself, or as a more idealized version of myself. And I think you know, when you started this whole conversation, you were like, the work just invites a reaction first and foremost. I have a, you know, I struggle with that a lot, because that's not, I'm not looking to provoke. I'm just like trying to be myself, you know? So it's like, when you are aware of the fact that your work does that, but it's not intentional, how do you sort of like deal with this set of circumstances that you've made for yourself, which is that the more you're allowed to be like yourself, the more there's this kind of like message that you're being told that you're provoking or something, which again adds up into this whole situation of like, I would say attack and defense or something. This idea of provoking without the intention means that you've got to sort of barricade yourself or get ready for some kind of retaliation. And I would say, you know, I don't look at a lot of art in the studio, but reading really influences me. And in the sort of 2 years leading up to the show, I was reading some Carol Cohn, who just wrote about gendered discourse in sort of like the context of foreign relations and nuclear policy specifically, but just like the language that's used by governments to talk about killing and protection and deterrence and whatever. It gave me sort of like a whole new set of things to think about in terms of my other like longstanding research into anthropomorphizing weapons. You know, the work, I think the process of making the work could be considered in Carol Cohn's set of dichotomous terms feminine, because it is mostly intuitive. There's not like a logical framework that decides what item goes in what part of what painting. So, you know, a lot of the names for the pieces are then sort of turned back into some kind of like technical term, like the long painting on that back wall is called Ditch Witch, which is an industrial trenching tool. I don't know, there's some kind of like reversal process. You know, if we can call like a World War II howitzer Bertha, you know, then surely we can go in the opposite direction and use that kind of like linguistic gymnastics event to help confuse the kind of like process of looking and understanding.
It's interesting. I was going to say, this is like a total side note. Along with Carol Cohn, I often think about the little book that Coco Fusco wrote called A Field Guide for Female Interrogators, where she talks about like the use of gender as like basically as a torture tactic in Iraq and Afghanistan. Which is also interesting, right? When you think about like not just the weaponization of gender, but literal women in the military and how that then, anyway, how then different kinds of gender components become literally activated. I think also there's, you know, like the kind of, what was it that you said, attack? It's like the attack defense mechanisms that happen are also like, also kind of become activated in the sort of like the way that the work is simultaneously like it feels really defended and really vulnerable at the same time. And I know that in some of your writings or in other interviews, you've talked about like this work is sort of like your ideal of aesthetic beauty, right? That what you're after in this studio is just like pure beauty almost, right? Pure beauty, like synthesizing the environment, and that like the experience that you're talking about where after that process, which, you know, like for you is very genuine, like a very earnest process of trying to make something well, right? Make it right, paint it the way it should be in this sort of very beautiful sense. As a product of your environment that teaches you what beauty is, right? Then to have, you know, someone come into the room and be like, these are about abjection. You're like, okay, well, does that mean, you know, like, is the consequence of that to then believe like, oh, okay, there's something about me, which of course is like which is something that socially we do all the time, right? To teach people to individualize what are actually social problems, right? Because I think the other, like the other more interesting consequence is like, oh, actually our concept of beauty, like inside of the things that we teach, for instance, women about what is beautiful already, like within that already exists the threat, the decay, like the toxicity, like the gorgeousness, the blooming, the all of this other stuff. But I think, like before going back into these questions about the social, which I think give your work so much pull, there's also like this really fascinating element in the work, which you also literalize because the work is so much about fascination. And I think that like one of the things about the work which is so compelling is like how it makes me believe that you're obsessed with all of these things. And so I just wanted to ask you in a way that's maybe even a little bit lighter, like to talk, about that experience of beauty and obsession.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny to me that like, I mean, I guess it's not funny, but it's just like, I've been making this work not for like a hugely long time, but long enough that it amazes me that I'm still like really pitching to people that like I'm having a great time when I'm making the work, and that I'm trying to make it look as good as I possibly can. But I loved when you said just trying to make the work well. Like making a good painting is so hard, and we are working as hard as we possibly can, and like we have jobs and there's all kinds of bullshit going on, and like why would I come to the studio and like make, I just don't have it in me to like make like ironic totally intellectual work. So yeah, I'm trying as hard as I can to make it look good. And I think part of the joy in being an artist is that my entire life is about the work. Like I don't have an off switch, and I don't see why when I leave the studio, everything I look at and read and think about doesn't immediately go back into the work, or how I can't be working on it all the time. And I think it's part of why I love working on paintings for so long, is to sort of let like my life model the work in this like really straightforward way. Just like I feel like I'm a dog chasing my tail. Like I feel like I'm trying to figure out what the work is about or how to make it. And every time I make something, I get closer to figuring out how to make it and, what it needs. And, obviously, maybe not obviously, but color is like a major joy for me. It's funny that this painting is up because I said I would make one blue painting for the show. I don't use blue a lot because I think it has so much to do with a conventional kind of beauty that I think mostly it's disgusting and I have nothing to do with it. And this painting has this like disembodied upside down upskirt mirror smile. The smile is from the first AI sex bot called Harmony. And the title is Cage. And I think like, to me, it just speaks to the fact that like we are all of us, including myself, because I did make a blue painting and I enjoyed it and I learned something from it. The point is that like we are all prisoners of our own taste. Like our experience with art is so affected by this thing that is taste or our own kind of aesthetic hierarchy, which either prevents us or opens doors for us in terms of experiencing art in this kind of way. There are things that we shut off, that I shut off. I am part of this thing too. Yeah, I wish I could just make every painting yellow. I can't. I understand that. But it's like these two paintings in the front are so funny to me because they are like the painting I forced myself to make and the painting, Patrick from the gallery knows how desperately I wanted a yellow painting to be, an all yellow painting to be in this show. So they're at home together, facing each other, having a face off in the front of the gallery.
I think there's something like, there's a lot of, the way that you talk about like a lot of different elements in the work also kind of deals with ideas about misrecognition. Like things that are misrecognized in good faith and in bad faith, you know, like things that are, you know, misused might be the bad faith misrecognition. But then I think that, you know, like these ideas about like good and bad, right, about taste and its implications, like a lot of those negotiations are sort of like, I think end up in a place that might be like at least neutral positive misrecognition, right? Where I assume something about you or about the work because it's like gray and hairy or something like this. And you assume something about, you know, someone else for other reasons. And I think that the way that you use smiles in the work kind of like encourages that a little bit, like these sort of, you know, like the machine smiles, like the use of teeth. Like whenever I see your work, one of the first adjectives that I'm left with is the idea of it being kind of feral, you know, like it's willing to bare its teeth. There are a lot of teeth in the work. And you know, not feral is good or bad, just this sort of like intentionally like the work intentionally like rattles the chains it's made for itself. And in that way, it lives in the space of the exploded diagram that you talked about earlier, right? Where you can only tell that like collapsing has any stakes if you become invested in the idea of a structure that might hold it together, right? If it was already chaos, we'd just be like entropy, it happened, you know? And so I was also gonna ask you about like the hair and the teeth and like why I know that's such a basic question, but like why you're so interested in fake hair and like what it is about teeth that you're into as well.
I mean, the faux fur is literally just a way to like put a layer down of something that is, there's like nothing more that I hate than just like a pure white surface. It's like intolerable. So I love putting the fur down because it's just one thing that right away takes every kind of rigid edge and makes it soft. You know, at every corner you get like a little like who's the kid with the flip on the end of his head from that TV show growing up? Anyway, Freddie Munster curl, you know. And like, you know, you layer it with paint and it's just like a beautiful surface to work on. So that's sort of like where that comes from. And then the teeth, I mean, I put other organic material in the work because tons of teeth are hard to come by. People know that I like teeth, so people give me teeth now, which is like the best. The 4 wisdom teeth in that painting in the back were all donation wisdom teeth. So I didn't, you know, it's like how I can only put so many wisdom teeth of my own in a painting. So I'm at the point where I've got to be harvesting from my surroundings. But painting in the back, the Ditch Witch piece has like a bandage from a surgery I had in it. I think like, you know, I started putting slices of the masturbators under plexiglass, sort of as like petri dishes, sort of as like microscope slides, sort of as display cases, sort of as reliquaries. And I love sort of putting things like masturbators or synthetic kind of references of the body alongside sort of my own organic material, like putting them together again in the same way that like the geologic record will hold all of us together. And you know, it's a way of sort of like marking time more directly via like modifications made to the human body. And I think also like ever since I was, maybe it was in high school, I first started really thinking about the body as like a piece of sculpture. And teeth are like a bone that gets to come out with not huge consequences that we get to look at. It's like a disembodied internal, partly external, like piece, as in like automotive shop part that we get to put in our hands and look at and examine sort of outside of ourselves. And I just really loved that experience of having my teeth pulled and getting to hold them. And I've always loved collecting and finding bones. And when my body fails or when things happen to it, I think about it, you know, as sort of like a machine. So yeah. I think also, like, you know, with material, I just like am a compulsive toucher. I shredded my bedding when I was a kid. I still do this totally embarrassing thing with my hair where like I run my fingers through my hair, and like it's so annoying and I hate it. And it has nothing to do with my hair. It's that I love the feeling of running things over my nail beds. So it's just like a weird thing. And in the studio, I get to fulfill that kind of like compulsive urge by touching stuff all the time. And it feels really good.
I was gonna say there's like the thing about touching in the work, and the way, like the fact that it feels really touched, and also like, you know, the way that it feels really touched and the way that those touches kind of like create forms that I recognize over and over again in the work. Like I start to see everything that's a little mound in your work, like a tooth. Like I know it could be anything, right? But it's like when you put the hair in like the little, like in the groups, I'm like little hair teeth, right? It's like they kind of end up forming these sort of recognizable they have the sort of like recognizable feel over the course of the work. But I feel like it also does have to do with a kind of comfort or self-soothing.
Mhm.
And the haptic in your work is something that like, you know, if the color is really bright, right, and that brightness, you know, like can create responses like some of the ones that we talked about before, the haptics end up becoming the sort of like psychological entryway into the work, where I start to see the work not just as visual objects or like kind of visually constructed things, but also like literally touched things, things made from physical processes, things made from a kind of like comforting or, you know, like repeated behavior. And that combination is something that like really, for me, evokes always Paul Tech. And the way that his work was both, you know, the reliquary and also like the announcement of the apocalypse or something like this. It was always simultaneously about preserving beauty and announcing like the kind of decadence and destruction that surrounded the body, literally. And so I also wanted to make a little bit of room to talk about like psychological drama and the idea that these works are kind of like, I mean, they're really emotional, right? It's like what you've been talking about, you know, like the range of influences is so wide from science to, like from science to mechanics to construction to gender theory to like, you know, international politics to these ideas about the military. But I think that there's also like, the work seems to operate on the level of a kind of like coping mechanism as well. Like how can we literally hold all of these things inside of our bodies, and how can art function as a kind of like prosthetic to help us manage all of these feelings, or something that was also made in our own image in this sort of abstracted way.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reality of being an artist, is that like you hope that you can participate in this like bizarro system of display and exchange and whatever, but that's sort of like the pipe dream. So you've got to be happy making, you know, the work has just got to be meaningful to you. I feel like the big mission I've been on is like nurturing the studio and like making sure that the work is fulfilling to me first and foremost. And yeah, it's like, you know, once that happens, then of course the work is a coping mechanism. It's like the way that you synthesize, seek to understand what's happening in your life, and make something that sort of like accurately reflects your internal world, or frame of mind or whatever. I think also like, you know, this is the place where I feel most in control. So it's like a power state for me to be in the studio making the work. And I think like, you know, making something that is so heavily touched but doesn't include that kind of like, again, we're dealing with sort of like, I think in some cases outdated art historical terminology. The idea of touch in art has been romantic mostly, and has to do with like author genius conversations. And I think touch is really hard to identify in the real world, like who the author is, who is responsible, who is in charge, who we can point to. So I think to me, touch is the condition of touch right now is so much about all over, about like claustrophobia. And some of what we know about massive weight is that it can be comforting and it can also be suffocating. And, you know, like the stakes in the studio are really that, like sometimes it's just right. And sometimes I go too far and have to paint the whole thing one color and sort of bring it back to just form and start again. So I feel like, you know, like everything, I guess, with the work, some of it is helpful and some of it is harmful, even for me in the studio, even for the work.
I have just a couple more questions before the Q&A, and they're also kind of lighter questions. I really appreciate like how deep we've gone, but I'm not surprised. And I just, you know, a couple of years ago when we were having a conversation about painting, and you were obsessed with gray. Like you were like, gray is the hardest color to make. You're like, it's the weirdest color and the hardest color to make. And it was always something that I thought was really interesting because of because your work is so chromatic. Although I think once I started looking for gray in your work, I started seeing all of the midtones, right? And I think that in some way, like your work is actually very much about these sort of like midtones or like a kind of drone or white noise that prepares you for red or for like the masturbator or for a tooth. Like there's a lot of this sort of like yeah, there's a lot of kind of like white noise in the work, which is one of the sort of like subtle surprises that I find within it. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about gray or about how you think about color at large, which is yeah.
It's, you know, I obviously love color. Someone was asking like, well, first of all, at the beginning, you were like, it's full of neons. There's no neon in the work anywhere. Everyone's like, your work, you use neons. I don't use neons. It just looks like there are neons because of the grays and the midtones. So it's like learning about, this has been my process. I used to use neons. And then like, eventually I was like, there's a way of making people believe they're seeing some kind of artificial toxic color. Of course, neon color exists in nature, but we won't get into that. But it's like, you know, again, more about control. So like, anyway, so there's this anecdote that I'll share, which is that in my painting one class, you may have had a similar painting one class where you have to use like black and whites and then use earth tones. And then like towards the end of the class, you get to use other color. And so for the first like half of the semester, I would pop open the CAD red light jar like at night when I was painting and just like look at it and like smell it. And I would be like, when can I use this one? Like, what are we doing waiting around to use what is obviously the best color of all of the colors? So I had this like kind of, you know, gut response to color right away when I first started using it, which had to do with its like chroma, but also its kind of viscous materiality and smell and everything. I would have literally spoon fed it to myself if the consequences weren't what they would be. So a lot of what happens in the studio is like, again, this like ping ponging between needing color, getting my fill, and then sort of like bouncing back and forth between like the convoy painting is almost entirely this like pinky gray. And then there's like that little hard face painting in the back, which is mostly red, CAD red. So it's sort of like I get my fill and then I get to go back and forth between using like grays and using pure saturated chromas. But yeah, I think part of using the power of those really juicy, rich colors is figuring out the midtone and gray thing. It helps the sort of like color be as powerful as it can be.
And the last thing I wanted to ask you about, Kari, was if you could talk a little bit about music, because I know that like listening to live music is a really active part of your life, as much as reading, I think, probably reading and processing. And yeah, open question. I feel like your work has the kind of intensity of the music that you listen to and the conditions that it creates. So I just wanted to make room for that as well.
I don't know when I did this, but I made a rule for myself at some point in the last decade, which is that I wouldn't listen to sad music anymore. So I don't. I am a trash can. I don't know if this is the right word. I am whatever you put into me. My mood is heavily affected by music, sometimes in not productive ways. So if I listen to sad music, I get really sad. It's just not helpful or productive for me. And in the same way, listening to music that I can sort of like front my bodily experience instead of my brain working. I love that feeling. When I'm in the studio, as a side note, I have to listen to like talk radio or podcasts. I can't listen to music at all because like if I'm listening to something upbeat, I make something upbeat. And if I listen to something sad, I make something sad. It's just like incredibly stupid and boring. So I like put my brain in story time and let it sit there and listen, and then I can get to work. But I love Gaby mentioned drone, loud electronic bass heavy music that like rattles my nostrils and shakes my pants on my legs. Like just the sensation of frequencies against your body, like shaking the water inside of your body, shaking the clothes on your body, I think is a way of feeling my body in a city space that is not like being catcalled on my way to work in the morning or something. It's just like it's an amazing sonic experience. And then I love all kinds of music, but yeah, I listen to a lot of doom and math rock, technical metal, polyrhythms. I think just like I love loud bass heavy music. That's basically
it, but but it's also it's music that like I know that like visuality and the auditory don't map onto each other. But it's music that even the way that you're describing it, like that requires that requires a haptic engagement as well as a kind of like sonic or conceptual understanding of what's happening, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which feels like it has so much to do with the way that your work is also structured.
Yeah.
That you have to have this sort of visual, you can't separate like the body from the mind ultimately, and your
Yes.
work kind of forces us to take like the body as having intelligence and also the mind as having its sort of
Yeah.
material properties.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that better than I could. I think like forever when I've been thinking about what I want, first of all, why the stuff is on the wall and why I'm thinking about it in terms of painting is that I've always thought that the perfect idea of a painting to me would not prioritize like image over object or object over image. Like if there was a way of having both of those symbols crash at the same time, then like that would be something that was really exciting to me. And I think part of that is because painting is so like cool and smart and collected. And I did want for the viewer to feel some kind of out of control physical response, like at the same time that they're recognizing imagery or seeing the image of the painting. Which again is just kind of like a I don't know, I think I've always been, me personally, I've been unsatisfied with just making images on canvas because they seemed like they were theoretical to me. So I wanted to make like something that was real, or bring something in my own mind that was like more really occurring into a space that should have just been purely contemplative or remote or something like that.
Yeah, I love it when we can like end on theories of painting, which is what I actually am, yeah, painting is theoretical and it also is a proposition. Like if in your studio practice, you're not making a proposition about like how this thing, which is a metaphor, correlates to life, then I sort of don't know what we're trying to do. So I appreciate that, Kari. And
I appreciate you, Gaby.
oh, yay, thank you.
Gaby and Kari, that was so brilliant. Thank you so, so much for that conversation. That was so wonderful to listen to. We have a couple questions from the audience. The first question is from our friend GE. And if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or post it in the chat and we will pass you the virtual mic. GE, here you go.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you, Gaby, and Kari. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you brought up the whole idea of venom too. I mean that's so exciting, and I know I want to pass that along to some friends of mine that are really into it as well. But I find the wonder of your work is really often how you seem to avoid the formulaic and just like patterns and systems. How do you do this?
That's a great question. I wish I had like a succinct kind of answer for you. I guess like because I'm not referencing other art or thinking so directly about other art when I'm making it, I'm really I mean, I do feel to some degree like I'm reinventing the wheel every time I make a painting. I'm like starting from scratch, which can be really hard. But I think because I work on a lot of paintings at the same time, one will lead me to thinking about a form or a, sort of direction for the next, and I can sort of drop what I'm working on and get right to work at sort of going off of the cues that the studio itself is giving me. So it's like at some point you have enough work going on in the studio that you develop your own kind of set of references or ecosystem of shapes or color or whatever. That's then just kind of fertilized by the rest of the stuff in my life, like the images that I'm seeing, or my family lives in Montana, so I go out there and if I see like wolf-like, and I might come back to the studio and start bringing like a spindly, you know, dead looking organic form into the work. So it's sort of just like, I don't know, it's sort of its own set of images at this point, the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, GE, and thank you for that answer, Kari. I have a couple questions for you, Kari. I was curious about, I wanted to hear you speak a little bit about line. In the press release for the exhibition, they're called Searching Spines, the lines in your work, and I really liked that idea. And I feel like so many of the works take on the appearance of a spine, both in like thinking about framings, but also in thinking about the body. It sort of evokes all the different things you've been talking about with Gaby over the course of the past hour. So I was curious how you think about spines and what they open up for you in your practice.
I mean, yeah, who doesn't love a spine? I think as like a mechanical structure, it's just like amazing. You know, again, it is just like a high functioning sculpture that sort of includes like these rigid forms with all of this kind of intelligent goo, you know, like the spine encasing something like the column and having cartilage between. So I think in, you know, just with the body is sort of the pinnacle of like something we know some stuff about and a lot that is a mystery. And when we look at ourselves, we don't have access to any of it. It's this kind of great reference point in thinking about form that is influenced by conditions of life and is like changing actively to some degree. And what we can't figure out is if the change is healthy or hurtful. But I think, you know, a lot of the like spindly stuff also comes from just like, there's an image on the Jumbotron painting of this yellow maggot, which is Galleria melanella, the silkworm or waxworm, which is able to metabolize plastic. When they're in caterpillar form, they have these amazing fibers that come off of their body, which are used as sort of a protective measure and also just as a way of gaining information about the environment. So, you know, it's like for the paintings, what they do is they keep the viewer literally at a certain distance. It's also like superfluous material. Like sometimes with wire, I will tie something on and leave like a long trail of wire because the wire is functioning to some degree. And also it just ends up being sort of like dead weight to some degree. But then it also sort of controls the access that a viewer might have to the surface of the piece. So.
I love it. Thank you so much for those answers. And then I'm also just a little curious about how you think about the digital realm relative to your work, which is so tangible and tactile, and focused on touch. And you incorporate sort of these references to the digital with images and really incorporate an eye for the digital realm and its just constant circulation of new images and new focuses. But I was curious how you think about those two realms in dialogue with one another in your work, if at all.
I guess I'm just thinking about it as material in the same way that anything else physical is material.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, if we're talking about a kind of like psychic residue from being alive, then like it has a very direct impact on the paintings themselves. I don't know. I mean, I think to some degree there is like a retaliation against like a smooth, frictionless surface that we're seeing in art, like that people want to touch stuff. Like if we look at weird trends like ASMR and like goo, like remember when everybody was making goo? Yeah. There is this kind of strange desire people have for sensation. You know, some of my like desire to make heavily like surfaced touched material is like, I'm predisposed to that. I to some degree, I think with all of our work, it looks the way it does, and that's like a little bit out of our control. We're just like into the things we're into. But I do also just think that in society there is like touch is becoming more bizarre like every day. Our phones are frictionless, but we touch them more than almost anything. And there have been like psychological studies where people are in MRI machines and they see like an iPhone, a generic iPhone, and their brain is sort of neutral, and then they see their iPhone and the like love, empathy, loss, longing part of their brain lights up. So we're just like confused about whether people are things or things are people, or our wires are crossed. I don't know how directly any of that is going into the work, but I can say that the digital images I come across have like a big formal impact on the paintings and what shapes they are and all of that.
Yeah, you can really feel that. Thank you so much for answering our questions, Kari. And thank you again to you, Kari and Gaby, for this conversation today. Thank you also to Patrick and the team at Nicelle Beauchene for all of your support in preparing for today's event. And we'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support our work at the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., you can join us for a conversation with Matt Phillips and Jason Stopa on the occasion of Hold Tight Horizon Eyes at Anna Zarina Gallery in New York. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today for this first conversation of 2024.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Gaby.
Thank you.